1942. World War II. World War II on the home front for the British was tough, but they were resilient, having endured the terrible Blitz from September 1940 to May 1941. During the attacks, the Germans had tried to relentlessly bomb the British into submission by mass aerial attacks, killing around 43,000 civilians and wounding another 139,000 in total. By 1942, the intensity of these bombings had died down, though the Germans still carried out regular bombing raids, especially in London. In February 1942, the British had endured nearly 3 years of blackouts and 2 years of German air raids, to the point they had become very much a part of daily life. Though for the British, the grim realities of war were never that far away. On February 8, 1942, the shocking news came that the mighty British fortress of Singapore was under attack by the Japanese. But also on that day, there was a gruesome discovery much nearer to home. In an air raid shelter in central London, a woman's body laid lifeless on the floor. It appeared that she had been strangled to death. The grim reality was, the likely culprit was not a German, but a British citizen. Thus started the week-long reign of terror of the Blackout Ripper. Day 1, Sunday, February 8, 1942. Victim: Evelyn Hamilton. Location: air raid shelter near Marble Arch in London. Age: 40 years old. Occupation: pharmacist. Evelyn Hamilton was last seen on the evening of that day. She had left her boarding house to get a late supper. Her body was discovered the next morning in an air raid shelter. She had been strangled to death, and her handbag had been stolen. Day 2, Monday, February 9, 1942. Victim: Evelyn Oatley, also known as Nita Ward. Location: in the victim's flat at Wardour Street in Soho, London. Age: 35 years old. Occupation: part-time actress and prostitute. On the day soap rationing was finally introduced in Great Britain, a woman was discovered dead in her flat in Soho, central London. In some ways, her murder did not surprise the police, as the victim, known as Nita, was a well-known prostitute. But what was shocking was the savagery of her death. She had been strangled and her throat slit. Her body had been horribly mutilated with a number of items: a razor blade, a can opener, and hair tongs. But the police did find one important clue, and that was from the clumsily discarded can opener. On it were fingerprints, but frustratingly it matched none on the police's criminal databases, though helpfully it suggested the murderer was left-handed. The second murder was only a 30-minute walk away from the previous day's murder, and strangulation had been the cause of death in both cases. But what really worried the police was the second murder was so much more violent than the first. Day 3, Tuesday, February 10, 1942. Victim: Margaret Florence Lowe, also known as Pearl. Location: in the victim's flat at Gosfield Street, Marylebone. Age: 43 years old. Occupation: prostitute. On Tuesday, February 10th, the day started with good news that the American allies, who had been in the war less than 2 months, had sunk the Japanese destroyer, the Natsushio. But for the British Metropolitan Police, there was a more pressing matter: trying to solve the murder of the 2 women. Unaware there had been another murder about a mile away from yesterday's murder, but the body was not discovered until 3 days later, on Friday the 13th. It had been another prostitute, a 43-year-old known as Pearl, who had been butchered in her flat. She had been strangled, but with a silk stocking or scarf, and her body had been horribly mutilated with a knife, a razor blade, and a candle. Fingerprints had been found on a candle. Day 4, Wednesday, February 11, 1942. Victim: Doris Joannet, also known as Doris Robson. Location: in the victim's flat at Sussex Garden in Paddington. Age: 32 years old. Occupation: prostitute and housewife. The next day, the police no longer had any doubt they had a serial killer on their hands, for in a ground floor flat they discovered 32-year-old Doris Joannet. Like the other women, she had been strangled and her body left horribly mutilated. By now, both the police and newspapers started to realize the 4 murders could be linked. The British newspapers dubbed the killer the Blackout Ripper and started to draw parallels with the famous Victorian serial killer, Jack the Ripper. Day 5, Thursday, February 12, 1942. Then there was a lull. Just as the press was whipping the British public into a frenzy, all went quiet. Had the killer learned to cover his tracks better? Day 6, February 13, 1942. Victim, Greta Hayward. Location, Piccadilly Circus, London. Age, 32 years old. Occupation, unknown. That evening, a young woman named Greta Hayward was waiting for her boyfriend in Piccadilly Circus in central London. A young man in an RAF uniform had started to chat with her, and then he had offered her a large amount of money, but she explained that she was not that kind of girl. Then moments later, he attacked her, dragging her into a nearby doorway where he started to strangle her. Luckily, the attack was interrupted by a night porter passing by, forcing the attacker to flee into the night. Victim, Catherine Mulcahy, also known as Kathleen King. Location, near Paddington train station, London. Occupation, prostitute. Later that evening, a mile or so away at a flat near Paddington railway station, a prostitute known as Kathleen King was entertaining a young man. Suddenly, the man turned violent and attempted to strangle her, but Kathleen managed to fight him off and scream for help. The man then fled in a panic, and in a clumsy attempt at trying to buy her silence, he threw a 5-pound note at her. In all these incidents and murders, there was a distinct modus operandi, so the police thought they were all being done by the same man. The attacks were all on women who were or might be prostitutes. They were all carried out in the evening or early hours. All took place in central London. Strangulation or attempted strangulations were used each time. Where there was an opportunity, the victims' bodies were horribly mutilated. So who was the assailant? Could it be that the murders were all related? Was an under-resourced London police force jumping to the conclusion that it was a serial killer's work, as it was easier to investigate them as one case rather than individual ones? The London police force had lost many of its best men to the armed forces and was stretched thin from its civil defense duties. From 1939 to 1945, crime rose by 50%, and an undermanned police force could not cope with the habitual looting and racketeering in the capital, as well as the social problems arising from desperate and homeless citizens. So was it convenient to overlook the subtle differences between the cases? Like in the Evelyn Hamilton case, robbery may have been a motive as she was carrying around 80 pounds in cash, which would be worth about 2,600 pounds today. This was because she was in the process of moving north for a new job. The two attacks on the night of Friday the 13th were clumsy. Could they have been the acts of an enraged drunk? A complicated relationship. Another possibility was that some of the victims had tangled and complicated relationships. Could they have been the cause of their demise? For instance, Evelyn Oatley had abandoned her Lancasterian poultry farmer husband to head to London to pursue an acting career, and Doris Jouanet led a double life as both a housewife and secretly as a prostitute. Her elderly husband had no idea that Doris would entertain men while he worked the night shift as a hotel manager. Could it be a copycat killer? This is not unheard of, for by midweek the murders were in all the newspapers. Could this have emboldened some maniac to carry out similar murders to satisfy their sick desires? Or a cunning murder to settle a score but made to look like the Blackout Ripper to throw the police off the scent? Was it a serial killer? The intensity and modus operandi would suggest so, and London had seen serial killers before like Jack the Ripper from 1888 to 1889, and George Joseph Smith, the Brides in the Bath murders from 1912 to 1914. With all these possibilities, the police had to put together all the pieces of the puzzle on who the Blackout Ripper was. At the scene of the attack on Greta Hayward, the attacker had left behind his gas mask case in the shop doorway. The gas mask's case carried the identifying number 525987, and RAF records revealed that it belonged to 28-year-old Officer Cadet Gordon Frederick Cummins. He was promptly arrested on Monday, February 16th at the nearby RAF barracks for the assault. It was discovered that he had no criminal record. He seemed happily married to a secretary and was doing well for himself in the RAF, having recently been promoted from leading aircraftman in a ground crew unit to an officer cadet training to fly Supermarine Spitfire fighter aircraft. But soon, things would start to unravel for Cummins, and the pieces would start to fall into place about this short reign of terror. It was found out that Cummins was in fact a womanizer, and he was left-handed. But there was also damning hard evidence linking Cummins to the murders. The police found a cigarette case in his uniform pocket belonging to one of the victims, Margaret Lowe. In a search of his quarters, detectives found a fountain pen that had belonged to Doris Joannet. But what sealed his fate beyond a doubt was his fingerprints on the can opener used to mutilate Evelyn Oatley's body. It took the jury just 35 minutes to find Cummins guilty. An appeal in early June 1942 was dismissed, and he was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on June 25, 1942, during an air raid. Cummins protested his innocence to the very last moment, and his wife stood by him until the end, believing he was innocent.